Paper 64. The Evolutionary Races of Color. This is the story of the evolutionary races of Urantia, from the days of Andon Infanta, almost 1 million years ago, down through the times of the planetary prince, to the end of the Ice Age. The human race is almost 1 million years old, and the first half of its story roughly corresponds to the pre-planetary prince days of Urantia. The latter half of the history of mankind begins at the time of the arrival of the planetary prince and the appearance of the 6 colored races, and roughly corresponds to the period commonly regarded as the Old Stone Age. 1. The Andonic Aborigines. Primitive man made his evolutionary appearance on Earth a little less than 1 million years ago, and he had a vigorous experience. He instinctively sought to escape the danger of mingling with the inferior simian tribes, but he could not migrate eastward because of the arid Tibetan land elevations, 30,000 feet above sea level. Neither could he go south nor west because of the expanded Mediterranean Sea, which then extended eastward to the Indian Ocean, and as he went north he encountered the advancing ice. But even when further migration was blocked by the ice, and though the dispersing tribes became increasingly hostile, the more intelligent groups never entertained the idea of going southward to live among their hairy, tree-dwelling cousins of inferior intellect. Many of man's earliest religious emotions grew out of his feeling of helplessness in the shut-in environment of this geographic situation, mountains to the right, water to the left, and ice in front. But these progressive Andonites would not turn back to their inferior tree-dwelling relatives in the south. These Andonites avoided the forests in contrast with the habits of their non-human relatives. In the forests, man has always deteriorated. Human evolution has made progress only in the open and in the higher latitudes. The cold and hunger of the open lands stimulate action, invention, and resourcefulness. While these Andonic tribes were developing the pioneers of the present human race amidst the hardships and privations of these rugged northern climes, their backward cousins were luxuriating in the southern tropical forests of the land of their early common origin. These events occurred during the times of the Third Glacier, the first according to the reckoning of geologists. The first 2 glaciers were not extensive in northern Europe. During most of the Ice Age, England was connected by land with France, while later on Africa was joined to Europe by the Sicilian land bridge. At the time of the Andonic migrations, there was a continuous land path from England in the west on through Europe and Asia to Java in the east, but Australia was again isolated, which further accentuated the development of its own peculiar fauna. 950,000 years ago, the descendants of Andon Infanta had migrated far to the east and to the west. To the west they passed over Europe to France and England. In later times they penetrated eastward as far as Java, where their bones were so recently found, the so-called Java man, and then journeyed on to Tasmania. The groups going west became less contaminated with the backward stocks of mutual ancestral origin than those going east, who mingled so freely with their retarded animal cousins. These unprogressive individuals drifted southward and presently mated with the inferior tribes. Later on, increasing numbers of their mongrel descendants returned to the north to mate with the rapidly expanding Andonic peoples, and such unfortunate unions unfailingly deteriorated the superior stock. Fewer and fewer of the primitive settlements maintained the worship of the breath-giver. This early dawn civilization was threatened with extinction. And thus it has ever been on Urantia. Civilizations of great promise have successively deteriorated and have finally been extinguished by the folly of allowing the superior freely to procreate with the inferior. 2. The Foxhall peoples. 900,000 years ago, the arts of Andon Infanta and the culture of Anagar were vanishing from the face of the earth. Culture, religion, and even flintworking were at their lowest ebb. These were the times when large numbers of inferior mongrel groups were arriving in England from southern France. These tribes were so largely mixed with the forest ape-like creatures that they were scarcely human. They had no religion, but were crude flintworkers, and possessed sufficient intelligence to kindle fire. They were followed in Europe by a somewhat superior and prolific people, whose descendants soon spread over the entire continent from the ice in the north to the Alps and Mediterranean in the south. These tribes are the so-called Heidelberg race. During this long period of cultural decadence, the Foxhall peoples of England and the Badanon tribes northwest of India continued to hold on to some of the traditions of Andon and certain remnants of the culture of Anagar. The Foxhall peoples were farthest west and succeeded in retaining much of the Andonic culture. They also preserved their knowledge of flintworking, which they transmitted to their descendants, the ancient ancestors of the Eskimos. Though the remains of the Foxhall peoples were the last to be discovered in England, these Andonites were really the first human beings to live in those regions. At that time, the land bridge still connected France with England, and since most of the early settlements of the Andon descendants were located along the rivers and seashores of that early day, they are now under the waters of the English Channel and the North Sea, but some 3 or 4 are still above water on the English coast. Many of the more intelligent and spiritual of the Foxhall peoples maintained their racial superiority and perpetuated their primitive religious customs, and these people, as they were later admixed with subsequent stocks, journeyed on west from England after a later ice visitation, and have survived as the present-day Eskimos. 3. The Badanon tribes. Besides the Foxhall peoples in the west, another struggling center of culture persisted in the east. This group was located in the foothills of the northwestern Indian highlands among the tribes of Badanon, a great-great-grandson of Andon. These people were the only descendants of Andon who never practiced human sacrifice. These highland Badonites occupied an extensive plateau surrounded by forest, traversed by streams, and abounding in game. Like some of their cousins in Tibet, they lived in crude stone huts, hillside grottos, and semi-underground passages. While the tribes of the north grew more and more to fear the ice, those living near the homeland of their origin became exceedingly fearful of the water. They observed the Mesopotamian peninsula gradually sinking into the ocean, and though it emerged several times, the traditions of these primitive races grew up around the dangers of the sea and the fear of periodic engulfment. And this fear, together with their experience with river floods, explains why they sought out the highlands as a safe place in which to live. To the east of the Badanon peoples, in the Siwalik Hills of northern India, may be found fossils that approach nearer to transition types between man and the various pre-human groups than any others on Earth. 850,000 years ago, the superior Badanon tribes began a warfare of extermination directed against their inferior and animalistic neighbors. In less than 1,000 years, most of the borderland animal groups of these regions had been either destroyed or driven back to the southern forests. This campaign for the extermination of inferiors brought about a slight improvement in the hill tribes of that age, and the mixed descendants of this improved Badonite stock appeared on the stage of action as an apparently new people, the Neanderthal race. 4. The Neanderthal races. The Neanderthalers were excellent fighters, and they traveled extensively. They gradually spread from the highland centers in northwest India to France on the west, China on the east, and even down into northern Africa. They dominated the world for almost 500,000 years, until the times of the migration of the evolutionary races of color. 800,000 years ago, game was abundant. Many species of deer as well as elephants and hippopotamuses roamed over Europe. Cattle were plentiful, horses and wolves were everywhere. The Neanderthalers were great hunters, and the tribes in France were the first to adopt the practice of giving the most successful hunters the choice of women for wives. The reindeer was highly useful to these Neanderthal peoples, serving as food, clothing, and for tools, since they made various uses of the horns and bones. They had little culture, but they greatly improved the work in flint until it almost reached the levels of the days of Andon. Large flints attached to wooden handles came back into use and served as axes and picks. 750,000 years ago, the fourth ice sheet was well on its way south. With their improved implements, the Neanderthalers made holes in the ice covering the